The engines came first. Not a sound so much as a pressure. A deep chest-thrumming beat that rolled across the lawn and swallowed the polite chatter whole, drowned the clink of champagne flutes, silenced the string quartet someone had hired to make the afternoon sound expensive. I stood in the center of it, on grass so perfectly manicured it looked painted on, while a sudden gale tore silk dresses sideways and sent napkins spiraling into the air like startled birds. My father, Richard, a man who had never once in his life entertained the possibility that his opinion might be anything other than fact, stood frozen. His mouth, mid-laugh, hung open in a mask of pure, uncomprehending disbelief. The laugh itself died somewhere in his throat as the shadow of a matte black helicopter slid over him like a passing eclipse. He always told people my head was in the clouds. What he never understood was what I actually did once I got there. I turned to face my stunned family, my mother's hand pressed to her chest, my brother's mouth hanging open mid-sentence, my father rooted to the spot like a man watching his own house burn down, and I let my voice cut clean through the roar. That's my bus. 2 hours before that moment, the afternoon had looked like 1,000 other afternoons I'd endured. Same lawn, same lies, same quiet, corrosive certainty that I would always be the footnote in somebody else's story. We were gathered at a lavish family reunion in a remote park pavilion, an event thrown, as most events in my family were, in honor of my brother Kevin, the golden child, the chosen son, the one whose achievements were treated like national holidays. This particular celebration was for his promotion to senior brand strategist at some marketing firm whose name I could never quite remember, because it never seemed to matter. My father held court beneath the pavilion's white canopy, a glass of scotch sweating in his hand, his voice booming with the kind of pride that vibrated in your bones whether you wanted it to or not. He was in the middle of recounting, for what must have been the 4th time, the story of how Kevin had closed the deal of the century with some beverage client, when he spotted me standing quietly near the edge of the crowd. Beside me was a man in a discreet charcoal suit, sunglasses tucked into his breast pocket, posture too controlled to be anything but professional. He was a senior agent with the Diplomatic Security Service, there under the pretense of a casual introduction, but really to give me a preliminary briefing on a joint operation that would begin in 2 weeks. It was supposed to be quiet, invisible, a 5-minute conversation lost in the noise of a family party. My father saw an opportunity instead. He swaggered over, glass in hand, and clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was engineered to look affectionate to anyone watching, but that landed on my collarbone like an anchor being dropped. This one here, he announced to the agent, loud enough for half the pavilion to hear, flies helicopters for the army. He paused, savoring it, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. Basically a bus driver with a fancier uniform, can't imagine it's very demanding. A few of the nearby guests chuckled. My mother didn't look up from her plate. The agent's smile didn't waver, professional, practiced, tight at the edges, but I watched something behind his eyes shift. A flicker, a silent recalculation. I'd been trained for years to read exactly that kind of flicker in a stranger's face, because in my world it usually meant the difference between a mission that succeeded and one that didn't. What I was reading now wasn't threat assessment. It was doubt. Doubt about me. My father had seen a simple, harmless guest to needle. I saw the man whose team's lives I would soon be responsible for keeping intact through hostile airspace. The insult itself barely registered, just another tally mark on an internal ledger I'd been keeping since I was maybe 9 years old, 1,000 small dismissals stacked one on top of another until they'd calcified into something almost unnoticeable. But this one was different. This one had an audience that mattered. This wasn't a slight at a barbecue anymore. This was a security breach. My father's ego, his relentless, bottomless need to diminish me in front of an audience, had just quietly undermined my operational credibility before a mission had even begun. This was no longer about old family wounds. This was about lives on the ground in 2 weeks, and whether the man standing next to me would trust the pilot flying him into danger. He thought he'd made another harmless joke at my expense. He had no idea he'd just planted a seed of doubt in the mind of a man whose extraction team I was about to be responsible for. To understand what happened next, what I chose to do about it, you first have to understand that I had been living two entirely separate lives for years, and my family only ever knew about one of them. To them, I was Avi, quiet, always somewhere else. The one with the government job too complicated to explain over dinner, so complicated that nobody in my family had ever actually bothered to ask a second question about it. Avi was a placeholder at the table, someone whose worth was measured not by accomplishment, but by how quietly she could sit through Kevin's stories without interrupting. They were comfortable with Avi. Avi didn't threaten the family's careful hierarchy. Avi didn't need to be reckoned with. They had no idea who Valkyrie was. Valkyrie was the person I became the instant the cockpit door sealed behind me and the world outside stopped mattering. Valkyrie flew through sandstorms that would have terrified my father into a heart attack. Valkyrie held a 40,000-pound aircraft steady on a cliff edge, while men who'd trained their entire lives to survive impossible situations trusted her not to kill them. And on this particular afternoon, Valkyrie was about to walk into Avi's world and burn the whole comfortable illusion down. I remembered one Christmas dinner with a clarity that still made my jaw tight. The dining room had smelled like pine garland and roasting turkey, a warmth that was entirely manufactured and never once reached me. Kevin held court at the head of the table, hands sweeping through the air as he narrated, in almost operatic detail, the story of landing a new sparkling water account. He talked about demographics and brand synergy like he was describing a military campaign, and my father hung on every syllable, his face glowing with a pride so intense it was almost physically warm. My mother, Carol, a woman who treated family harmony as a fragile heirloom to be protected at any cost, even the cost of her own daughter, kept refilling Kevin's wine glass, urging him gently to keep going, to tell them more about the campaign, the client, the deliverables. At some point in the lull, I tried, the way I always tried, to find a small opening. I mentioned that I'd just come off a grueling month-long high-altitude training exercise in the mountains, a program that had pushed my body and mind to their absolute limits, that had nearly broken people stronger than me. My mother patted my hand without looking up. "That's nice, dear," she said, her voice a soft, practiced wall. Before I could say another word, she turned back toward my brother. "Kevin, tell us more about the marketing budget." My father chuckled into his napkin. "Still playing with the government's expensive toys, huh, Avi?" The ledger clicked forward another entry. I thought of the tuition they'd poured into Kevin's business degree without blinking, the car loan they'd co-signed without a second thought. My training that could, quite literally, mean the difference between a team of operators coming home or not, was, to my father, a game. A toy. Something to be dismissed with a napkin and a chuckle. There was another memory I carried, one I rarely let myself revisit because of how much it still stung, even years later. I was 17, home on a rare weekend from a summer aviation program I'd fought tooth and nail to get accepted into, one of only a handful of students chosen from the entire region. I'd come home buzzing, desperate to tell someone, anyone, about the first time an instructor had let me take the controls solo for 30 full seconds. I found my father in the garage, elbow-deep in some engine project he'd been nursing for months. I told him about it in a rush, words tumbling over each other, and for one brief, shining moment, I thought I saw something that might have been interest cross his face. Then Kevin's car pulled into the driveway, fresh off winning some regional debate tournament, and my father set down his wrench without a second thought and walked straight past me to go greet him. He never asked me to finish the story. I stood alone in that garage for a long time afterward, staring at the half-disassembled engine, learning a lesson that would take me another decade to fully unlearn. In my family, my accomplishments were interruptions to be tolerated, never the main event to be celebrated. Now hold that memory next to Tuesday, 3 months before the reunion. I was strapped into the command seat of an MH-60M Black Hawk, call sign Valkyrie 1. Outside the windscreen, a sandstorm raged with a fury that reduced visibility to almost nothing, turning the world into a churning wall of orange static. Below us, clinging to a narrow, treacherous mountain ridge, in a region I'm not permitted to name, a Delta Force team was pinned under fire and needed extraction immediately. The green glow of the instrument panel was the only steady light, in a universe of violent, howling chaos. My co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer 5 Miller, a man with more flight hours logged than I'd had hours of sleep that entire month, spoke over the internal comm. His voice calm in the way that only comes from decades of practice, keeping calm when everything else is screaming. Ice Valkyrie, that's a negative margin landing. Wind shears unpredictable. He wasn't wrong. A negative margin landing meant there was no room for error, none at all. The rotor blades would pass within inches of a sheer rock face. One wrong gust at the wrong second could send us spiraling into the abyss below, taking a dozen lives, theirs and ours, down with us. I took one breath. My hands were steady on the cyclic. In that cockpit there was no Avi. There was no father's voice, no napkin-muffled chuckle, no ledger of dismissals. There was only the mission, the storm, and the men on that ridge who needed to come home. "We don't leave them, Miller," I said, my voice as level as his. Adjusting for sheer, "I've got this." I brought the aircraft down through the storm in small, precise increments, fighting the wind gust by gust, correcting a half-second before the aircraft even asked me to. The rotor wash screamed against the cliff face. The landing gear kissed rock and skidded and held. For 2 of the longest minutes of my life, I kept that machine motionless in a place the wind didn't want it to be, while the operators, barely more than silhouettes in the storm, scrambled aboard one by one. The last man in, the team's sergeant, paused before he ducked inside. He looked toward the cockpit and gave me a single, sharp nod. It wasn't praise. It was something rarer than praise. It was absolute trust, offered from one professional to another, the kind of currency my family had never once had in their wallets to spend on me. That's the real core of the problem, the thing that took me years to understand. My family didn't just misunderstand what I did for a living. They were constitutionally incapable of understanding it, because understanding it would have required admitting that the quiet daughter they'd spent 2 decades overlooking might actually be the most extraordinary person at their table. I remember my mother pulling me aside once, after another one of my father's rants, her hand soft and pleading on my forearm. "You know how your father is," she whispered. "His world is so black and white. Just let him have his moment with Kevin. It's easier that way, for everyone." What she meant, of course, was that it was easier for her. Easier than confronting him. Easier than disturbing the fragile peace she'd built her entire identity around protecting. Her desire for a quiet dinner table mattered more to her than my reality did. And in its own quiet, bloodless way, that was the deepest cut of all, deeper than any of my father's jokes, because it came wrapped in the language of love. For years, I let them keep their comfortable version of my life, because it was simpler than fighting for the truth. But standing on that lawn, watching the DSS agent's careful smile flicker with doubt, I understood that their comfortable narrative had just collided head-on with a reality I could no longer afford to let them ignore. My father only ever respected things he could see and touch. Numbers on a business card, a title stitched into a uniform, the roar of an engine loud enough to rattle his ribs, those were the only currencies he'd ever recognized as real. He had spent 30 years refusing to see me clearly, and quiet words were never going to be the thing that changed that. I had tried words. I had tried patience. I had tried, more times than I could count, simply hoping that time itself might soften him. None of it had worked, so I decided it was time to show him something he would never, for the rest of his life, be able to unsee. As my father's laughter faded into the noise behind me, something inside me went perfectly, dangerously still. The old, familiar sting of humiliation was gone, replaced by a clarity so cold and clean it almost felt like relief. I walked away from the catered tables and the polite party chatter, my focus narrowing down to a single operational problem, the way it always did in the moments that mattered most. The doubt I'd seen flicker across the agent's face wasn't a personal insult to shrug off. It was a contamination. A threat to the mission I'd be flying in 2 weeks, and threats to the mission got neutralized. That was simply how the job worked. This had stopped being about my feelings the second my father opened his mouth. It was about restoring control over a situation that had just spun dangerously out of it. My hand closed around the hardened comms device in my pocket, a small, unglamorous piece of my real world hiding in plain sight at a backyard party. The objective in front of me was simple, even if the execution wouldn't be. Erase the question mark my father had just carved into the agent's assessment of me. My credibility wasn't a matter of pride anymore. It was a mission-critical asset, and it had just been compromised in front of the one person who needed to rust it most. I pulled up the recall directory on the secure screen. The window was tight, tighter than I liked. A standard extraction from a location like this would mean routing a sterile vehicle out to a remote pavilion, driving to the nearest airfield, and flying out from there, a delay of at least 90 minutes, maybe more. 90 minutes the mission timeline simply didn't have. If I didn't move now, the operation itself could be scrubbed before it even started. Failure in this particular equation was not an option. My thumb scrolled through a list of operational procedures, most of them familiar, routine, the kind of thing you executed on autopilot. And then I found the one I had only ever studied in simulation, never once expected to actually invoke. Directive 7. Emergency field extraction from a non-secured civilian zone. It was a protocol of absolute last resort, high cost, high risk, the kind of maneuver that ate through resources and demanded direct command authorization, reserved for circumstances dire enough that the mission mattered more than the budget, more than the discretion, more than the very real possibility of a dozen bystanders filming it on their phones. For a single heartbeat, I hesitated. This was an enormous lever to pull for what had started as a comment over cocktails, but the justification underneath it was airtight, and I knew it. This wasn't a tantrum dressed up in military language. This was a tactical necessity, plain and simple, and I had the authority to say so. I began composing a coded message, stripping the language down to something precise, professional, entirely devoid of the emotion actually driving it. I wasn't writing, "My dad hurt my feelings," to General Hale, my commanding officer, a man who treated the world as a series of problems to be solved efficiently and had approximately zero patience for anything resembling an excuse. Compromised interagency confidence. Need to demonstrate immediate operational readiness and asset capability to concerned party on site. Activating Directive 7 to meet critical timeline. Requesting immediate bird to current grid. I hit send. The reply came back in under 15 seconds, just as precise as my request had been. Justification approved. Valkyrie 1, your bus is on the way. Hold the LZ. That was it. The pieces were already moving. This wasn't some elaborate trap laid for my family's benefit. It was a calculated, necessary piece of operational theater, staged for exactly one audience member who actually mattered. My family, and their entire self-satisfied little party, were about to become the unwitting backdrop for a capability demonstration they would never forget. I walked back into the party, and it felt for a moment like stepping into a country whose language I no longer spoke. Kevin was still deep in his victory monologue, tossing around words like synergy and deliverables as though they were profound revelations he'd personally discovered. The guests, mostly my parents' friends, mostly bored, nodded along with the particular glazed politeness reserved for other people's success stories. I ignored all of it. My attention had already shifted to the wide, open stretch of lawn beyond the pavilion, the only patch of grass large enough for what was coming. I walked toward its center, my shoes sinking slightly into the manicured grass with each step, and checked my watch. The clock was running now, and there was no stopping it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the DSS agent watching me, not casually, not the way you watch someone at a party, but the way you watch someone when your instincts have just told you something is about to happen. His expression was unreadable, but his focus had sharpened into something almost predatory. He knew. My father, of course, couldn't resist one final jab. He spotted me standing alone, apart from the crowd, and his voice boomed across the open lawn, thick with the particular condescension he reserved just for me. "Leaving so soon, Avi," he shouted, already grinning at his own joke before he'd even finished it. "Don't let us keep you. Bus stops that way." A ripple of laughter moved through the friends closest to him, the easy, complicit laughter of people enjoying a small cruelty because it costs them nothing. I didn't look at him, I didn't need to anymore. I just tilted my face toward the empty sky and waited. There was nothing left to say to him, no explanation, no defense, no desperate hope of finally being understood. All those years of being the footnote, the placeholder, the joke at the edge of the table, were about to be rewritten in real time, whether he was ready for it or not. It started as a feeling before it became a sound, a low, rhythmic pulse that traveled up through the soles of my feet before my ears ever registered it. Whump, whump, whump. A heartbeat buried somewhere deep in the earth, growing steadily, deliberately stronger. Kevin's speech faltered id sentence as a few guests glanced around, annoyed at first by the interruption, unsure yet what was causing it. The sound kept building, gaining texture, sharpening into a definitive, percussive roar that you didn't just hear but felt vibrating in your ribcage. Every conversation on that lawn died at once. Heads turned, first confused, then alarmed, scanning the tree line for the source of a noise that had no business existing at a garden party. And then it broke through the trees. It wasn't a helicopter in the soft, harmless way most people picture helicopters. It was a weapon given wings. A matte black MH-60M Black Hawk, stripped of every marking, moving with a speed and discipline that had nothing polite about it. It didn't glide gently into view the way a tour helicopter might. It sliced through the air like something with intent, an apex predator that had just found exactly what it was looking for. It banked hard, and its shadow swept over the entire party at once, a sudden dark eclipse blotting out the afternoon sun. The roar became a physical force now, a deafening pressure wave that rattled glasses on tables and shook the ground under 300 pairs of feet. The Black Hawk didn't land, not in the conventional sense. It descended with an almost surgical precision and settled into a low, rock-steady hover, 3 feet off the ground directly in front of me. The rotor wash hit the party like a hurricane arriving early. Tablecloths ripped free and cartwheeled across the lawn, glasses shattered, plates went airborne, and Kevin's carefully rehearsed presentation notes vanished into a blizzard of white confetti that scattered across the shocked crowd. People screamed and ducked, shielding their faces as the manicured lawn dissolved into a storm of flying debris. The side door slid open. Framed inside it were 2 crew chiefs in full combat gear, faces hidden behind dark visors, utterly still, utterly composed, specters from a world my family had spent 30 years insisting didn't exist. I finally turned to look at my father. The smug smirk that had lived permanently on his face, for as long as I could remember, was gone, wiped away completely, and replaced by something I had genuinely never seen on him before. A slack-jawed, hollow-eyed disbelief that bordered on real fear. His face, ruddy with pride only moments earlier, had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. My mother, Carol, had both hands wrapped around Kevin's arm, her knuckles white. Her carefully maintained composure shattered into pieces she would spend the rest of the evening trying to sweep back together. They weren't looking at a machine anymore. They were looking at an irrefutable fact, a truth so loud, so physical, so undeniably real that it was quite literally tearing their comfortable world apart, tablecloth by tablecloth. In the eye of all that noise and wind, I felt something settle inside me that could only be described as peace. I held my father's terrified gaze and let my voice cut clean through the roar, steady, clear, final. "That's my bus." I turned away from him, from all of them, and let my attention land on the only other person on that lawn who actually mattered. I looked at the DSS agent and gave him a single, sharp, confident nod. It was a silent transmission that needed no translation. "This is who I am. This is the capability at my command. Your team will be safe with me." He answered with a nod of his own, and this time there was no professional flicker of doubt behind his eyes, only something closer to respect, plain and unguarded. The question mark my father had planted was gone, blown away along with the tablecloths. Somewhere behind me, I heard Kevin's voice crack out a single, useless word, "What?" swallowed almost instantly by the roar. I didn't turn around. There was nothing in that word I needed to hear, no apology hidden inside it, no sudden understanding. It was just noise, the same kind of noise that had filled every family gathering I could remember, except this time it was drowned out by something real. I turned and sprinted for the waiting aircraft, wind tearing at my clothes, and with the practiced efficiency of 1,000 repetitions, grabbed the harness, clipped in, and was hauled aboard. The Black Hawk didn't linger for a photo opportunity. Its nose dipped, and it surged upward with a force that pressed me back into the seat, vanishing over the tree line and out of my family's world in a matter of seconds. My father had spent my entire life, believing my job was a punchline. It took 30 seconds of rotor wash to blow that punchline away for good. I wasn't there to see what happened after the aircraft carried me over the horizon. My focus had already shifted entirely to the mission ahead, the way it always did the instant that cockpit door sealed. But the story of what unfolded on that ruined lawn trickled back to me later, during a debrief with the DSS agent. He described a scene of absolute, deafening silence, broken only by wind moving through the wreckage of the pavilion, shredded tablecloths, scattered chairs, a single abandoned wine glass somehow still standing upright on its side table. My family stood frozen like figures in a diorama of their own disaster, nobody quite able to be the first to speak. He said he walked over to my father, who was still staring up at the empty sky as though the aircraft might reappear if he just looked hard enough. The agent didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone, by his own account, was cold and quiet and utterly final. He held out his business card. "Your daughter is not a bus driver," he told my father. "You have no idea who she is." My father took the small, stiff card automatically, mechanically, his eyes never once leaving the sky. The agent turned and walked away without waiting for a response, leaving my father standing alone on a ruined lawn, holding a tiny rectangular key to an entire universe he had never known existed. A universe in which, for the first time in his life, he was not the center of anything. I like to imagine him staring down at that card later that night, at the official seal, at the man's title, and feeling 30 years of willful ignorance finally collapse on top of him all at once, in total silence, with no one left around to soften the blow. My mother told me a version of that same evening weeks later, in a phone call I almost didn't answer. She said the ride home from the pavilion had been the quietest car ride of her entire marriage, that my father hadn't said a single word the whole way, just stared out the window with the business card, still pinched between two fingers, like he was afraid letting go of it would make the whole afternoon stop being real. Kevin, for his part, apparently spent the drive scrolling frantically through his phone, trying and failing to find so much as a single grainy photo of the helicopter online, as though proof of the moment might somehow help him process it. There wasn't any. Some things simply aren't meant to be posted. 6 months after that afternoon, the ground beneath my life had shifted permanently. I stood at the head of a sterile briefing room, the air humming with the low, focused energy of professionals about to walk into something dangerous. On the screen behind me were the operational schematics for our next assignment, Operation Scythe. The room was full of operators drawn from half a dozen different units, every face serious, every set of eyes fixed on me. The same DSS agent from the party sat in the front row. When I finished walking the group through the air insertion plan, he was the first one to speak, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "My team's confidence in our air support is absolute, Major." Major, not Avi. He never had to say my name at all. In that room, I had exactly one name, and it was Valkyrie, not a nickname, not something cute assigned by fellow pilots over drinks, but a call sign earned the hard way, in sandstorms and on cliff edges, forged under conditions that had nothing to do with the family I'd been born into. That was my new reality, and I never once took it for granted. There were no loud toasts for a marketing deal in that room, no desperate hunger for a father's approval hanging in the air. There was only the quiet, deeply earned respect of people who understood exactly what was at stake every time we lifted off, people who knew what it meant to hand someone else your life and trust they'd bring it back to you intact. It was a respect I had never once gone looking for, but one I had built, mission by mission, until it simply became who I was. I found my real family, in the end, in a cavernous hangar late one night after a brutal mission, the air thick with the smell of jet fuel and ozone. My crew and I, Miller and the 2 young crew chiefs, sat together on an old supply crate, passing a single bottle of water between us in near total silence, too wrung out to say much of anything. We were covered in sweat and grime and the particular exhaustion that comes from having stared down something enormous and survived it together. There was a camaraderie in that silence that I'd never once felt at any dinner table growing up, unspoken, unforced, entirely real. We had walked through the fire together, and we had brought everyone home. No grand speeches were necessary. We simply knew, without discussing it, that this crate, this silence, this exhaustion, was what belonging actually felt like. It was a foundation built on competence and mutual reliance, and it stood as a fortress against the kind of conditional, performance-based love I'd grown up chasing and never quite catching. Miller broke the silence eventually, the way he always did, with something dry and understated that somehow said more than a paragraph of praise ever could. "Good bird today, Ice," he said, using the call sign only he sty. LL bothered with from our earliest days flying together. That was it. That was the whole speech. And it was worth more to me than every toast my father had ever raised to Kevin combined, because I knew exactly what it had cost Miller to say it, and exactly what it meant coming from a man who didn't waste words on anyone who hadn't earned them. I thought, in that quiet hangar, about how strange it was that the people who knew the least about me, the people who had never seen me hold a hover in a sandstorm, never heard the particular calm that settles into my voice when things go wrong at altitude, had spent the most time deciding who I was allowed to be, and how the people who actually knew, who had trusted me with their lives more times than I could count on both hands, never once needed to ask. One evening, weeks later, I was alone in my office plotting flight paths for an upcoming training exercise when my personal phone, a device that rarely made a sound anymore, buzzed once on the desk. I glanced down at it and felt my breath catch for a fraction of a second, an old reflex I hadn't fully outgrown. It was a text from my father. "Your mother and I saw a story on the news about a rescue in the mountains. Was that you?" It was, as far as I could recall, the very first time in my entire life that he had asked me a question about my work that carried even a trace of genuine curiosity, let alone something that might have resembled respect. Somewhere underneath the calm I'd built for myself, the old, invisible child who had spent decades starving for exactly this kind of question, felt a small, involuntary flicker of triumph. But it was only a flicker, and it passed almost as quickly as it arrived. I looked at the words glowing on the screen for a long moment, and what settled over me instead was something far steadier and far more permanent, a genuine, peaceful quiet. The question mark sitting in his text didn't actually require an answer from me anymore. The anger I'd carried for so long was gone. The old hurt was gone. The desperate need to be seen by him, the thing that had quietly driven so much of my life, was finally, completely gone as well. My sense of peace no longer belonged to him. It wasn't his to grant or withhold anymore. I held my thumb over the screen for a second, and then, with a calm, deliberate motion, I archived the message without replying. My eyes were already back on the flight map spread out in front of me, tracing the routes that led toward whatever came next. My legacy wasn't waiting for me in a text message. It was waiting for me in the sky, where it had been the entire time. Sometimes I still think about that DSS agent's face in the instant before the rotor wash hit, the split second where doubt and disbelief, and something almost like awe crossed his features at once. I think about how much of my life I spent believing I needed my father to wear that same expression before I could finally exhale. I don't need that anymore. I don't need it from him, and I don't need it from anyone else standing on a lawn somewhere, arms crossed, waiting to be convinced. The people whose respect I actually need are the ones already strapped in beside me when the storm hits, the ones who don't ask twice before trusting me with the controls. Everyone else is just scenery, and scenery doesn't get a vote. My father always thought my ride was just a bus. In a way, he wasn't entirely wrong. I just happen to drive the one that goes straight through hell and back, every single time, to make sure everyone else gets home safe. If you've ever had to prove your worth in a world that refused to see it, tell your story in the comments below. In this community, we know exactly what a real ride looks like.